to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the investigative journalist Nick Dearden. He is the director of Global Justice Now. He's also the author of the new book, Pharmanomics, How Big Pharma Destroys Global Health, available from Verso. Nick Dearden, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So your book goes through a lot of different issues with the pharmaceutical companies. And so to think about, where we might enter this conversation, I thought maybe we could begin as you do in the book with, a microcosm, one of the examples that's touted as a bad apple that made the news, the infamous Martin Shkreli. You bring us back to that case as a kind of case study in, something that we can all obviously understand as predatory and wrong way to deliver medication to people. Maybe you could just remind us first of the facts of what happened there.
Of course. So this guy was basically, his background was in finance. He came from a hedge fund. And he said, by his own admission, he moved because there wasn't enough money to be made in hedge funds for him. So he thought, he thought Big Pharma was a more profitable way to go.
And he was right.
And he was absolutely right. And what he did essentially was look around for drugs, had a bit of time left on their patents where, were coming to the end of their patents, but where other companies, so that means the drugs that he was looking at were still kind of had monopoly rights applied to them. But he figured, well, I've got a little bit of time left before other generic companies can come in and make these drugs and the price falls massively. So I'll buy them up. I will then jack the price up by, hundreds or thousands of % overnight. And that will make me a nice income stream for the time remaining before anyone else can make these things. And so, the most famous case was he brought this drug out, which is extremely useful at fighting certain infections, particularly for people who are HIV positive. And he jacked the price up, several thousand % overnight. And I think the incredible thing about Shkreli is, he kind of does it all with a smile on his face. Yeah. Right. So he's not.
A smirk, I think, is more like it.
Yeah. So, he kind of brags about it. And he says, well, this is how the industry works. This is how capitalism works. And therefore, I'm not some evil guy. I'm actually playing by the rules of this system, and I'm doing it extremely well.
Yes. Well, what I think is interesting is, you cite his case in the example. You quote him saying, my shareholders expect me to make the most profit, not half or 70%, but 100% of the possible profit. This is a capitalist society, capitalist system, capitalist rules. And he said that the other pharmaceutical companies might like to pretend they're in a different category, but he said, quote, they don't have any higher moral ground to comment on what we do. I take it that your point in the book is he's kind of right about that because that's true. It is the way the industry, he is not a bad apple, or the smirk is the only thing that distinguishes him from the rest of the industry.
Exactly, right? And he takes it to an extreme. He does it with a smile on his face. He enjoys playing the role of the pantomime villain. But beyond all of that, there's something right about what he says. And of course, that's why the rest of the pharma industry hate him. I mean, not because of what he's done, but because he exposes this deep truth about the way that they actually operate.
Yeah, well, so maybe we could dive into that a little more. So the thing that he did then, which is gaining control of intellectual property and using, which is a state-enforced monopoly over the, some set of knowledge, and then using that to extort as much money as possible. As you point out, that is just an extremely common way to make money.
Yeah, it's really common. So, the big thing, the big takeaway for me from this research was you've got an industry here, and we think this industry basically invents drugs that, deal with awful diseases and then profiteer off, right? And that we assume that's how the industry works. And the industry likes to tell us, well, yeah, you might not like us, you might not like the amount of money we make, but essentially, at the end of the day, without us, there's no medicines. And what I discovered is it's completely untrue. They don't, by and large, invent medicines. They behave like hedge funds. They buy the rights to produce medicines that have been made by others with public money or small biotech companies, and then they squeeze the most they possibly can out of those drugs, whatever the consequences to society, whatever the consequences to how unaffordable they are. So actually, the way Shkreli's behaved is no different from the way that AbbVie has behaved when it comes to drugs like Humira, invented by someone else.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So this is a drug, very useful drug if you've got Crohn's disease or rheumatoid arthritis. It's kind of anti-inflammatory. This drug was created on the back of massive amounts of research going back many, many years, kind of brought to development by a company that AbbVie then buys up, right? So AbbVie had nothing to do with inventing this drug at all. They bought up the rights to the drug. They then spent a bit of money. They claim that money was improving it. But I mean, all of the evidence points to the fact that far from improving the drug, nothing was made better about the drug in terms of the patient's experience of it. Essentially, what we think that development was about was making small so-called innovations that actually allowed them to extend the patents even beyond what they were already given. Just these very, very small changes. It's called evergreening. And then they can apply for new patents on it. And then they jacked up the price. And then they turned Humira into the most expensive drug in the world. And I think we're talking about just below $100,000 per patient course for this drug. So a phenomenal amount of money, even in my country, where most of our drugs are paid for by the National Health Service. This wasn't available because it was just too expensive. When it was available, it was rationed. In the US, it is only the very richest people who could possibly afford to get this drug. And what's this company done other than made a lot of money off this drug?
Now, can I just ask you a side question there? Because you mentioned the National Health Service. I think some people might assume that because you have a single payer there, that the National Health Service could force down a lot of the prices on these things and keep them under control. So why doesn't that happen?
And to some degree, it can. Mm-hmm. Right. So the National Health Service pays far less for our medicines than you do here in the US because we do have the ability to negotiate. But sometimes the companies just will not play ball. Right. I mean, they want it to be provided by the NHS because, of course, they're going to make some sales off that, but not if it fundamentally damages the price that they're able to charge in the US. So there are times they simply won't negotiate on them. I mean, eventually we got there, although it still cost an awful lot of money. But I think it's a really good point you make, because I think the problem here is that the industry has actually become unsustainable now. The amount they are trying to get for these new drugs is so astronomical that even single payer systems like we have in large parts of Europe are struggling to afford the prices that they can negotiate with these companies.
I want to go back to what I think is this core point, because you go through some of the history. You point out this is not, in fact, a new phenomenon, that these pharmaceutical companies have become more financialized and more like hedge funds over time. But you point out that, half a century ago, there are hearings about predatory pricing by drug companies. And always the story in response is the same talking point, which is the prices are high because the research is expensive. If you do anything to regulate the prices, you are going to kill innovation. You are going to kill research. You hear that, you heard that half a century ago. You hear that today from Bill Gates. Always the same point. So I feel like addressing this point is so crucial to exploding the basically the only myth they have, because they repeat it over and over and over.
It absolutely is. And the fact that we kind of all believe that to one extent or another it's because that myth was created by the pharmaceutical industry, and it was created by the pharmaceutical industry to avoid regulation. So there was this moment, like you say, in the kind of 1960s, where in the US and the UK and elsewhere, medicines had said that the pharma industry as we know it kind of emerged after the Second World War, and they became enormous giants on the back of a whole bunch of blockbuster drugs like antibiotics, steroids, vitamin supplements, tranquilizers, all these drugs that we hadn't had before. They kind of changed the way we as citizens, we as people, relate to medicine. And this made them phenomenally profitable, but it also drew a lot of attention to what was going on here. And so there were Senate hearings, there were hearings in the UK Parliament to say, actually, we've got to control this industry because it's quite central to our lives. And Big Pharma, of course, didn't want that because they wanted to make as much profit as possible. And so they created this myth, that we still talk about today. The problem is the myths become less and less true as time's gone by. I mean, there was some case to be made in the 1960s that they did actually create drugs. It's still based on, like everything in science, it's still based on generations of kind of previous scientific knowledge and so on, that you would think you shouldn't really be able to monopolize. But nonetheless, they did actually produce some stuff. In the most infamous case, I mean, Purdue Pharma produced OxyContin. They were then utterly egregious in the way that they marketed that drug to people, but it was their drug, if you like. Whereas nowadays, the idea, holds no water whatsoever, because the drugs that they are profiting so handsomely off, they haven't even created. And yet this myth is still there. They're the goose that lays the golden egg for the economy. They are important to us and our individual healthcare. Heaven forbid, like we do anything whatsoever to constrain their behavior.
Well, and as you point out, it is not only that they have stopped laying golden eggs, that is to say, innovating new life-saving medicines, but the incentives of these profit-seeking institutions are such that they can actively thwart the possibilities for making. I mean, you point out a number of ways, and I want to distinguish some of the various different issues, that these terrible incentives that actually make global health worse, that prevent us from discoveries that we might achieve if we didn't have profit-seeking institutions with bad incentives.
Completely, right? So it's discouraged them, it's disincentivized them from actually creating important medicines. So you can see it with antibiotics, right? Antibiotics, we know, are beginning to lose their effect. This is a major problem for humanity, right? Our entire medical knowledge depends upon having antibiotics. You wouldn't be able to, you could die of, simple cuts on your finger if they were to get infected in previous ages before antibiotics. Cesarean sections, certain cancer treatments, they all rely on antibiotics. We need to discover new antibiotics. The pharma industry is investing nothing in this research at all. There's no incentives in it to do that, because any new antibiotics that they create today are going to be, second generation. They're going to be used very sparingly. They're going to be used when our current antibiotics fail in patients. And they simply reason there's not enough profit to be made in holding such a drug. By the time we're going to make any serious profits, our patents will all be expired. So there's no incentive to deal with a kind of health issue of epidemic proportions. And so they're just not doing it. And so the incentives built into the system are, like you say, actively preventing them doing the job that they're supposed to be doing and we assume that they're doing.
And I think you point out that vaccine research is another area that is, massively underdone because it's not the most profitable.
It's not at all. So you look into a pandemic, the possible pathogens that could cause a pandemic. Well, it might not happen, right? So you could be sitting on a bunch of research here or a bunch of intellectual property that's making you nothing at all because it might not happen. So going into COVID, the industry had done almost nothing. The World Health Organization said years ago, there's these 16 pathogens, right, that could cause a pandemic. And yet we are alarmed to see that almost no research is being done by Big Pharma into these areas. There's some research that's being done, but it's being done, it's being funded by the NIH. It's being done at universities and by public researchers and so on. And they were absolutely right. And COVID hits. The pharma industry has got nothing, right? Fortunately, thanks to public money, we have got some. We've got some information into how these viruses work and how we might be able to deal with them. The problem is, in order to develop that, we simply handed over that research to Big Pharma, and they were able to monopolize the vaccines that came out of it and decide who got them and who didn't. Right? Essentially, who got to live and who got to die. That was placed in the hands of pharmaceutical executives who'd done nothing to research, or almost nothing, to research these vaccines in the first place. And some of them became billionaires out of that. And the result for the rest of us, for the rest of the world, was massively inequitable distribution of those vaccines around the world and an artificial limit placed on how many we could make.
Yeah, maybe you could go into a little more detail here about, as we look back over the COVID pandemic, just how grotesquely unfair the resulting distribution of both vaccines and profits was out of that.
Absolutely. So you've got the two companies who sit on the kind of gold standard mRNA research for COVID vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. Like, end of the first kind of year of those vaccines being proved to be effective, virtually all of their sales had gone to the richest countries in the world, and nobody else, right? Nobody else really had anything because, they were simply signing contracts with the most powerful government leaders. That was where they expected to be able to make their money. And they wouldn't share the technology with anybody else. And it worked for them, right? So it didn't work for the billions of people who didn't have access to their vaccines, who could have done, but it worked for the pharma executives. I mean, the Moderna board, the head of Moderna and several members of his board became multi-billionaires, right? And this was the only product they had on the market. And all of the sales were like massive sales to a handful of governments, right? So this is easy. You're not desperately trying to persuade people to get your product. You have a captive market, and they become multi-billionaires off the back of it. Pfizer, in the first year of its COVID vaccine coming out, made 36 billion in sales. Second year, it added an antiviral, and those two drugs alone made it $50 billion. So the most any company has made out of one or two drugs in history in a single year. Vast. And yet, who could get these was restricted to a tiny fraction of humanity. I mean, by and large, the only Pfizer vaccines that were given in the majority of the world only got there because the US donated, a fair wad of its doses. Otherwise, they would have had none.
I think just to drive this point home, it's fair to say that there are a lot of people who are not alive today who would have been alive if, we'd had a more equitable distribution.
That's exactly right. I mean, we know the vaccines were effective in preventing people from dying. People still got COVID, but we know that the suffering was reduced and the likelihood of death was reduced. And so, even in this really extreme situation, we're being locked down around the world where people are dying in phenomenal numbers. Even in that situation, Pfizer and Moderna held on to their intellectual property and refused to share it with the many laboratories and factories around the world that could have created more of these things. I mean, even if they'd done that, let's be clear, they would still have made all of the money they made, right? They would still have made all of that money. But what they couldn't, and I think this goes to the heart of the problem. The problem is that they make their money, they believe, and they're right to a degree, in the monopolization and control of a technology. Like, the worst thing you can do is share that. Right? Because the money is not coming so much from the fact that you're selling a lot of doses, you're selling a lot of pills or whatever. It comes from the fact that you control and monopolize that knowledge. You wall it, you enclose it, you place a wall around it, and you prevent others from getting it. And that's what makes it valuable to you. And that's key to the problem that we saw in COVID, because it was that precise monopolization that was preventing the many other factories and countries that could have been producing from producing it. And they would have still been rich, but not rich enough, right? It goes back to Shkreli's point. It's not about making my shareholders rich. It's about making them as rich as I possibly can.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't remember if this comes up in your book, but I feel like in the United States, especially, there's now a lot of kind of suspicion of Big Pharma, but then, they've almost, through tarnishing their reputation, encouraged conspiracy theories to flourish that make people not want to take vaccines because they think, well, the companies that make these are just trying to make as much money as possible. I don't trust a word they say. I don't trust them not to lie to me about whether these things are safe. Therefore, I'm not going anywhere near that. So there's this other thing where it having the profit motive in the health system hurts, but quite almost rationally, people come to distrust things that they're being told because they don't know if those things are true.
I think that's exactly right. I think they're almost encouraging the proliferation of conspiracy theories by the fact that they're so untrustworthy. And you can see this all over the world, actually. I mean, I looked at one case in one part of Nigeria where there was an outbreak of meningitis I think it was in the late 90s. And, the pharma company rushes in, thinks this is brilliant because we may have a new drug that deals with this. Let's test it out. And behaved in an unbelievably unethical way. I mean, the kind of way that would never have been allowed in the West, where, in patients where they realized it wasn't working, they didn't transfer them onto kind of older medicines. And in that part of Nigeria, to this day, there is just immense suspicion of Western medicine. I mean, people just don't want it. And, not surprising, really. And it makes our job, those of us who kind of think it's a good thing that you take vaccines for diseases, it makes our job harder. And what I say to people is, look, you don't need to come up with any conspiracy theories. You just need to look at how these companies openly act. And that explains the fact that they're entirely driven by shareholder maximization. But it doesn't mean you need to distrust the science. What we actually want to do is liberate that science from the grasp of these corporations so that they're no longer making these astronomical profits and denying many people around the world medicines that could help them. I mean, I completely agree. We're kind of, in some ways, you're fighting a losing battle because they're so untrustworthy as corporations.
Well, it's kind of like how the Tuskegee experiment here sort of destroyed confidence in, among African Americans in public health system because they're like, well, sometimes we're lied to. So, and you document all sorts of, you mentioned one example there, foisting expired and dangerous medicines on the global south, various kinds of experiments and tests that don't reach the standards that will be applied in the West. I mean, just really rotten treatment of people in the global south as if they are less valuable people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a case I worked on, this was a few years ago now, but just, it's quite expensive to dispose of medicines that have gone past their date. You can't just throw them in the bin. You've got to go through a process of disposing of them safely. But in order to get a tax rebate, the companies would claim that these things were donations and just send them somewhere else. Send them to the middle of an emergency situation. Then they'd get the tax rebate. They wouldn't have to dispose of them safely. It was basically a way of saving them money. And you'd end up with all sorts of inappropriate stuff that people didn't understand how to use or, would have no need for. The most extreme one being an appetite stimulant sent to a famine zone, just to get rid of this stuff. I mean, extraordinary stuff, just to kind of limit at the end of the day, the money that you should be paying to get rid of stuff that's gone out of date safely. And of course, in COVID, same thing, right? I mean, by the time many people in the world did get, insofar as they were able to get vaccines, very often they would be very close to their expiry date by the time the countries actually got them. And of course, that's going to worry people in those countries and make them think, well, I don't want a vaccine that's gone off. So
fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough. So I'm not going to get vaccinated.
I mean, there's so much that is documented in your book that we can't go into it all. But one of the issues that you mentioned earlier that I want to dwell on is, we talked about some of these bad incentives, and you mentioned marketing because, you do talk about the opiate epidemic here and this incentive to, even when you have drugs that have a legitimate purpose, there is an incentive to encourage doctors to prescribe these inappropriately because it makes you a ton of money if they do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you are obviously, everybody, I think, in the US is very familiar now with the opioid epidemic. A drug created that was unbelievably strong painkiller, that should have been extremely rationed in terms of who it was given to. This is end of life care. But they decided, well, the way we're going to make profit off this is not just by giving it to a very few people. We need to give it to absolutely everybody. Even moderate pain. You should be taking an OxyContin. I mean, that was the idea they put into doctors' heads and spent an awful lot of money convincing them to do that. And also, kind of creating research to suggest this wasn't addictive. When, any normal person would have been able to look at this drug and say, obviously, that's going to be an extremely addictive drug because, it's not unlike heroin. I mean, you don't need me to tell you this. I'm sure listeners will know all about it, and you can watch, Painkiller if you've got a Netflix subscription to see how all of this happened. But yeah, really, really, really unhelpful incentives, to say the least, built into the system. It doesn't really matter what the cost is in terms of people's healthcare, in terms of life and death. What matters is making us money. And again, I think Purdue were quite honest about that, which is one of the reasons it's so fascinating. I mean, Sackler, the Sackler family, Arthur Sackler, the kind of patriarch of the family, actually developed these marketing techniques selling Valium for Roche in the 1960s. He theorized, well, the most effective way of doing this is to market to doctors because people trust their doctor. So that it's more effective than us as a company selling directly to kind of trying to get ordinary citizens to buy this stuff. You've got to kind of almost corrupt, I guess, people who the patients ultimately trust. And they did that to an incredible degree with OxyContin.
And made a lot of money. And it goes back to, and then destroy trust in doctors, right?
Yeah.
Because people are going to find out the truth.
Of course. The incredible thing is these little happy, I don't know if you've seen the show, but these incredible little cuddly toys they created that were like OxyContin pills with little arms and smiley faces and so on. It's really, really incredible. And sometimes those incentives will be sell as many as possible in a completely inappropriate way. Sometimes they will be, sell hardly any. And that doesn't matter either, because then it becomes, what you're doing then is you're turning medicine into a kind of luxury good. Something that only the few can afford. And that's how we're going to make our money out of it. But in both cases, it's a completely inappropriate way of dealing with that medicine. But the incentives built into the system encourage them to do that.
And I suppose there are other examples of, if a company's selling a lot of drugs, it has a very strong incentive to conceal or downplay when it doesn't work.
Oh, yeah. Hugely. And I think that's the thing to remember about pharma, particularly in the US, the way that this isn't just a kind of powerful industry which has a lot of lobbying clout. It's almost become integrated into the very systems that are meant to regulate it. It's become integrated into the health professional system by corrupting doctors and so on. It's become integral to the way that, by giving money to universities and setting up partnerships and so on, the way that research is actually carried out. It has an insidious relationship at all levels of society that impact on its operations. And I mean, someone's described that as a kind of, pharmaceutical industrial complex, which is, it is not simply going to be dealt with by restricting lobbying power. As much as that might be important in itself, you need to actually root out the kind of power that this industry has at all different levels of society.
You have that incredible story in the book of the Canadian researcher who's pursued by the pharmaceutical. She discovers that the drug doesn't work. I'm not going to remember this, the facts exactly right. It's just a remarkable extreme case of what can happen if you try to dissent and you have this kind of integrated system where research is being corrupted. Yeah,
she's Nancy Oliveri. She still works in Toronto. An incredible story where she's a world expert in this very, very rare disease. A company comes along and thinks it might have the answer to reducing the suffering of her patients. She tries it out. She's like, it's going well at first, and she's quite enthusiastic. But then she realizes some really very dangerous and worrying side effects. She goes to the company and reports this. And she says, and look, I'm going to tell my patients who are on this trial about this, because of course they have a right to know. And then she starts getting, threatening phone calls. She gets threatening letters through the post. She's told to shut up and not tell her patients, otherwise they're going to take legal action. She gets dismissed from her job because she works in a university that the company is giving money to. I mean, she really gets hounded. Her life and her career is really on the edge, and she has to fight like hell to get it back. And, for doing what you would regard as the basics, for doing what you would regard as, just telling you the truth about the stuff that you're taking. And the company actually tries to rush this drug out because they say, we don't really care what you found here. There's money to be made here, and we're going to start producing this thing. So yeah, she's a great example of how that insidious power kind of works throughout the world of research.
Yeah, and so that's at its most extreme, but you document so many different instances, and so many of them seem to come down to this same problem of the way that markets and the profit motive corrupt public health. So let's conclude here with, you make clear in the book that you're not offering a bleak and pessimistic look entirely, that you do think there are alternate ways of organizing the research, production, and distribution of necessary medicines. We can do this differently, can't we, Nick Dearden?
Absolutely, we can. We really can. And I think it is a hopeful time in that I think COVID has kind of woken people up to what's gone wrong. For many governments in the world, they were really astonished because they'd been told, don't worry about it. You don't need your own production facilities. You don't need your own research and development. The market will provide. And when the market doesn't provide, don't worry, we'll help you out with some philanthropy, with some charity. COVID hits. The market doesn't provide. The market seizes up. They can't get hold of anything. And by the way, we're not going to give you anything as a donation either, right? So you're on your own, essentially. And this wasn't just very poor countries, right? This was reasonably rich developing countries like South Africa and Brazil. And so they've kind of woken up and they're kind of saying, right, if we want to be protected next time, we need our own manufacturing, we need our own research and development. And they're beginning to do that. There's a great example of a hub that they went to Moderna and Pfizer. They said, we want to learn about mRNA so we can make vaccines, not just for COVID. We think it might be possible to make mRNA vaccines for TB, for HIV, for certain types of cancer. Moderna and Pfizer were like, we're not playing ball with that. You're on your own. They did it, right? They cracked a COVID vaccine quickly. They still need to work out, how you actually go about producing that and getting it in people's arms and so on. But they may even be on the verge of creating a vaccine for TB there. So, and then the really revolutionary thing about what they're doing, they're saying, we're not going to monopolize this knowledge. We're sharing it with countries around the world that have the ability to produce and work on. They're being collaborative, So I think that's really exciting. But I think even in the United States, there is a realization, a recognition that what happened was simply not right. I mean, I quote some guys in the US administration who were trying to negotiate with Pfizer and Moderna during the pandemic. And they're like, Pfizer was trying to charge them $120 a dose, they claim. it came down in the end. But I mean, they were like, these guys are war profiteers. And the incredible thing is they didn't even invent the vaccine, right? So there's one guy from the administration who's quoted in an FT article saying, this is the greatest marketing coup in medical history. The fact we call this thing Pfizer's vaccine. It's not Pfizer's vaccine. They didn't even invent it. So there was a recognition that what happened there was completely and utterly out of control, given the amount of public money put into this stuff. And I think you're seeing that in some of the policies enacted, both at a federal level, but also at a state level. I mean, California now saying, we're just going to start to produce insulin at cost and get it out to people because we can't deal with this profiteering anymore, because it's having a detrimental impact of such scale on our society. That even in the country which, is kind of historically been in love with the market, it's failed us.
Well, I think for more details on all of the cases that we have discussed here today, our listeners and readers need to pick up the book Pharmanomics, How Big Pharma Destroys Global Health. But as I say, and as Nick has indicated there, he also lays out alternate possibilities that will not leave our health at the mercy of the free market forever. I did just want to ask if you could tell our listeners a little bit about what you all do at Global Justice Now. If you could just tell us a little bit about your organization finally.
Yeah, so we believe essentially the problems of the world in terms of poverty, inequality, climate change, they're kind of baked into the rules of the global economy. The global economy that we've seen develop over the last 30 or 40 years, it's had a really detrimental impact on many people's lives. But it's had a very positive impact on the lives of corporate CEOs and their shareholders, right? In fact, the economy was kind of built in their image. And like you say, many of the rules that govern how our economy works are maybe very good for the profits of the few, but have been a complete disaster for the lives of the vast majority around the world. And we challenge those rules. So, when it comes to pharma, we're challenging the intellectual property rules that give them this immense power to monopolize knowledge that we believe is illegitimate and they shouldn't have. But, similar rules exist that are kind of fueling climate change and protecting the fossil fuel industry. And we campaign against those rules too. And, it's a big fight. You're up against huge vested interests, but, you can win. And I think, we've beaten trade deals, we've beaten investment deals that would have made things worse. And we're now beginning to unravel, I think, the economy that was put into place in the late 1990s and which has prevented countries and people and communities having control over their lives. And we try and do that with an eye to not just our own society, but of course, people around the world who also need the same rights as we've got, who also want to live with decent healthcare and education and so on. So we try and create a kind of international feeling and an international spirit in the way that we create new policies and laws for the world.
Well, we here at Current Affairs wish you the best of luck. You can follow Nick Dearden at NickDearden75 on Twitter. You can follow Global Justice Now at Global Justice UK. Nick Dearden, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
It's a complete pleasure. Thank you very much.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.